And so there's a lot of work for folks, and it's preference work oftentimes, because they want local community, working with local community. So in that sense, it's been really helpful. Yeah.
So you said that like for school when you went to your counseling wasn't like they told you to go to trade school, but like with your family, was like that something to like go to school? Did like if you wanted to do it, were they like supporting you? Because you also said you had a lot of military family, so were they more like, go to the military or like how was that?
It's this weird thing where I didn't get a lot of pressure to go into the military. That was more like my dad. He got a lot of pressure to go into the military in his generation. Our generation didn't really get that. And the ones that did go to the military were ones who were like, I need to get a leg up, or like I need something to do, I need to not waste my life. It wasn't like we're gonna push you into it. Ask me the question again. So there was
Like if like for your family.
to go to school. And so I felt there was more a push to go to school from my family. So less to go into the military, definitely go to school. That was definitely a big part of and it was go to school and don't work outside. That's why you're going to school. You're going to school so you don't have to work outside. You want an indoor job, you don't want an outdoor job, that's why you're gonna go to school. That was very much from my family, who was a lot of construction workers, right?
Did your mother inspire you to become an organizer, or was this like
Yes.
something with a passion?
I didn't even know it was a thing, right? Until I saw my mom do it. I didn't even know that that's what because I don't think my mom called herself an organizer either. Or maybe she did. Yeah, there was a lot of community organizing happening. Anyway, I saw her do all of this work with the community, and I went with her to a lot of it because I was just that age, right? Because my brother because we're all 6 years older, so 6 years apart. So when I was like 12, my older brother was 18 already. My younger brother was like a little baby. And so I went with her everywhere. And that was like her big organizing heyday. And so I think that's what happened. And so I was like, oh, I guess this is what I'm gonna do with my life. But it wasn't until a union, it wasn't until I took a year off of work. I took a year off of school because I did an ACE program like this and was in school like that. And then went right into college. And then I took a year off because I was like, I'm tired. And I went to go work for America West Airlines because they give you free flight benefits. And I was like, I'm gonna travel and not pay for it. And so I did that for a year. In that year, they had a unionizing campaign. So I had a union organizer knock on my door and was like, hey, I'm doing this thing and your workplace isn't very good to women in particular. Let's have this conversation. And then they never look back, right? And I was like, wait, I know what an organizer is. I've heard of this before. I didn't know you could get paid for it. What? But yeah, as soon as I understood what he was talking about, I was like, oh, I'm familiar with this. My mom did this, just on a neighborhood level. But that's how I got into it.
What education path did you take to prepare for it?
Before organizing?
No, when you decided I want to be an organizer now. Did you redirect your education? You said you took a year off.
I did redirect my education. So I took a year off, went back to school, because I got hired for union organizing. You did. I was on the steering committee. I was on the worker organizing committee. I was in it. So what happened was, I was on the worker organizing committee. We're organizing internally. We lost the campaign. I got fired. Went back to school. Started the campaign up again, but this time as an organizer and not as an internal worker, and won the following year. That, when I went back to school that year, made me realize that this isn't helping me, and so I stopped going to school. I stopped going to school. I actually haven't finished my degree. I am like maybe 3 classes away. what happened was I started organizing. I did America West Airlines the year after, and then I was an organizer and went to do construction work, organizing, right, working with construction workers. At the time, ASU was expanding downtown campus, their Tempe campus. They were just building. And so if I'm working with construction workers and they're looking for work, they ended up having a bunch of workers that I was working with who were being exploited doing work on ASU campus. So I ended up organizing a bunch of students. We ended up protesting on campus to sever their contracts with these companies. That put me into a direct conflict with Dr. Crow, who's the president of ASU. And I started to understand all the ways that Dr. Crow and ASU profit off of the exploitation of a lot of brown refugee undocumented workers to build their beautiful sites. And I realized, like, and your education sucked. I was a poli-sci major, political science. I have learned way more outside of that school than ever in. And so, holding true to my values, I was like, well, if I'm not really getting value out of this, why am I paying for it? And so I didn't go. I stopped going back. And that hasn't actually hindered any of my, I actually turned way more jobs down now than I ever had being in that institution and trying to go that way. I have way more access now than I ever did. I have also better teachers now than I ever did over there.
In the community?
Yeah. When you start to really recognize that you can choose your teachers and choose what wisdoms that you want to learn and embody, it's very liberating. And it don't cost nearly as much.
I'm curious about your ideas about this unlimited potential of the American dream, because you mentioned a lot about institutions and systems and all of that. How do you see the pathway of somebody that is from a minority community accessing that infinite possibilities of the American dream?
I think that they would have to reject the American dream. I don't think it's true. There's this, I don't want to say this. Can I draw something on the board?
Absolutely. Oh, we have to find a marker that works. Yeah.
It's gonna draw this intersectional feminism, Bell Hooks. She has a book called Margins to Center.
Will you write her name and the book title over there too, just if somebody wants to follow up with it? It's a great, also you guys, these resources, think about what resources you use for integrating into your paper, right?
So Bell Hooks basically is intersectional black feminist, and she says, we live in a racist society, it's built off of white supremacy, and so we should acknowledge that hierarchy. And the problem is in that hierarchy that we don't ever talk about power. And so she's like, every place has a center of power, and every place has margins to that center, every place. And then she asks, let's name the center of power. And it's like people with money, right? People with degrees, people who own land. These are all demarcations of power. People who have access politically. These are social norms of power, and that because we live in a racist society, the people who oftentimes hold that power, the demography, male, white, cisgender, a citizen, right, probably speaks English, so on and so forth. And that's really who occupies the center. And socially, right, because we live in a social hierarchy, the further you get away from that center, the less power you have, the less access you have. And so your ability to actualize the American dream is determined by how much you can get into the center. That's really what it means to access the American dream. is going to the center of power. I do this workshop all the time with people of color, women of color in particular, and I say, well, what is, if this is true, what are spaces dominated by these people, by these types of things? And they always say like hospitals, universities, government. Right? These are all things that we need and are oftentimes dominated and dictated by people here. And so when we think of intersectional Black feminism and they're like Black, queer, trans, poet, blah, 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 what they're saying, what they're naming often are like, who are the folks furthest on the margins of society? Who oftentimes don't, right? Them trying to get access usually bears a cost. And if you're further and further on this margin, then the more cost it takes and the least likely it is that you're actually gonna attain it. Right, so if you're like a Black trans woman who doesn't speak English, even if you want to get here, there are so many barriers that you may not ever actually get there. And if data holds true, which it does, that's why you get disparity. Does that make sense? And so, yeah, we're always expected, right? American dream is like, yeah, but you want to go here, right? Everyone wants to be in the center of power. And it's like, well, not actually. Like, why? Why does it have to cost us all of this to go in here? If that's the American dream. And the American dream means, 2-car garage, single family house with access to insurance and high education and governmental, representation. Like, sure, but if you can't actually get any of those things, then like, what's the point? And so when people say the American dream, that's oftentimes what I'm hearing. And what bell hooks and folks are saying now is like, well, why do we have to go to the center? We have our own communities, right? We can live out here, it's fine. We just need the center to relinquish all of these resources. Like, if this is where all the money is, we gotta redistribute wealth. Because then that would allow us to create our own centers where, you have your center, we can coexist, but my center doesn't have to look like one particular way. My center doesn't have to be governed by one particular set of ways of doing things, right? And so that's all I don't know if that answers your question, but for me, there is to try and go for the American dream is just to like fit into this model, and I don't want to do this model anymore, right? I want to have my own centers. I want to like not have to go through all of this stuff. When I go get healthcare, I want to get healthcare that looks different than some of the hospitals I go to, right? That doesn't reflect back any culture, doesn't reflect back any like real understanding of who I am and what may affect my health, right? But like public health is so sterile. And when we think why it's so sterile, it's because it's built off of this very limited, undiverse center. Right? It's a homogeneous, it's the opposite of diversity. And if the opposite of diversity is what's holding all the power and demanding everyone else, the diverse masses, to conform to one way of doing things, it's what kills diversity. And diversity would actually say we would have multiple ways. We would have multiple things. We wouldn't just have one hospital that looks like a school that looks like a prison, right? They all kind of look the same. They all have this like weird hierarchical structure of like paperwork and insurance, and you gotta sign off. Like that's only one version of a hospital. Yet all of our hospitals are supposed to look like this. Doesn't make sense. It's not diverse at all. And so it's the opposite of diversity. The American dream is the opposite of diversity.
then what to you is like your definition of diversity?
So, you know, the United Nations, when they talk about health equity, they talk about people being able to live their fullest potential. That's what their definition of when you attain health equity, right? You lived your healthiest, fullest potential life. To me, that's what diversity would be as well. Is everyone gets to actualize their fullest potential, which means it would be free of this weird hierarchy. It would be free of whiteness, of white supremacy. It would be free of patriarchy, right? That says there's only one, the real men, there's only one kind of man, right? Real men, this archetype, this homogenous thing that all expression of men are supposed to be, anti-diversity, right? But if that structure didn't exist, men would be able to express a whole spectrum of ways of being, the diversity that we would see. And so that's what that means to me. Right? Diversity is the abolishment of these weird hierarchies so we can actually actualize our full potential to be. I don't know if that answers your question.
If you haven't asked a question, lead with your courage.
How do you approach time?
How do I approach time?
That's good.
So I am really wrestling with a new approach to time. There's an indigenous approach to time. So we think of time in the past as looking back, in the future looking forward, right? As if we can pioneer into the future and determine, right, which way we're gonna go. It's very colonial, right? It's very like, so, you know, what was Christopher Columbus, right? We're gonna explore. There's indigenous teachings that say, well, actually looking into the past is looking forward. You can see into your past. And so if your body is gonna be a metaphor of time, then past is in front of you, because you can see that. Future is the unknown. You can't see that. Future is behind you. You're not sure what's gonna happen. And so indigenous teaching says, so you have to, if you wanna best prepare yourself for the unknown, then expand your field of vision. And if you expand your field of vision into the past, the more you look at the past, the more you can see, the more you can see, the more you can see, the more you can see. And all of a sudden, because another concept of time is a spiral, which means things are just spiraling around you, right? And if you're alive long enough and you pay attention long enough, they're just patterns that reiterate themselves over and over again. So even the future is destined to just be another pattern at some point. And so if you can look into the past enough and tap into that ancestral wisdom that can get passed on to you, and you look and you look and you look and you expand your field of vision, and you can look into the past to your greatest possible potential, then you can start to see the patterns that will help you prepare for the unknown. Does that make sense? So that's how I look at time.
Have you ever experienced racism?
All the time.
In what ways?
So I sit on the South Mountain Village Planning Committee. So Phoenix is broken down into 16 villages, right? The little geographic areas. And it's a planning process, right? So every village is the first step for development, right? So the developers have to go to the village makes recommendations on the development, that goes then, all village recommendations then go to the planning commission, which then goes to the city council, and the city council says, okay, you can develop or you cannot develop, or you have to develop in a certain way. So it's a way to like checks and balances for development, right? So I sit on a committee for South Mountain Village, and there are, there's like a third white a third brown, and a third black, essentially. The audience is almost always white, almost always. And almost always new homeowners that have not really lived in South Phoenix very long. So all new housing developments, which means they're usually represented by HOAs, homeowners associations, or newly formed block watches. And gated communities, right, especially new gated communities, are high end, so only if you're affluent do you get access. And so it tends to be this influx of new white populations that come into South Phoenix, the formerly segregated part of town, right? Coming to a meeting about the continued future building and development of this community. And when I bring up these histories of like, do you realize, new homeowner, that you live in the formerly segregated part of town, and that history has direct linkages to the fact that we are the most unhealthiest village in all of the city. And that when we think of development, we gotta think about the health and wellness of these people. And their response almost always is like, that's nice, but we need the things that we need because our money pays for those people. Our tax dollars is what's gonna help those people in the first place. No care about history, no real care about what is my responsibility as a new resident living in this neighborhood. No sense that he's speaking almost exclusively for like a white enclave. Like that right there is racism. It's structured. It's racism in part because they're seen as the most powerful people in the room because they have all the leverage. And so the fellow white members that are on the board are like, well, they showed up and this is what they said and this is what they wanted. And if those people that lived here longer than these people, if they wanted to be heard, they should have shown up. More structural racism, right? Because it's like, well, again, you're asking them to show up to a meeting that doesn't have childcare. You're asking them to show up to a meeting that doesn't have paid translation. You're asking them to show up to a meeting that's in jargon that nobody speaks. Right? And so all of these things are structural, are racist, right? Because they lead to an outcome that is detrimental to people of color. The outcome is clear who it will hurt. And there is a severe well, it doesn't matter because it's not the way that they should have showed up without any accounting of why. So all of those things for me are structural racism. That is what racism is. And it happens every meeting. Every meeting.
How do you see the generational impact now that younger generations, their mentality per se, is a little different than past generations?
Hopeful and it's like a little bittersweet. So I actually think.
First of all, what generation are you? Let's start with that. Are you Gen X? Are you a millennial?
I think I'm a millennial.
When were
82. I'm like right there.
Yeah, I'm the end of Gen X, so you're just millennial.
I'm like, I'm a millennial, I guess.
Barely.
I guess. Barely, right?
Yeah.
So I think there's two things that the up and coming generations have going that I think will be very different. One thing we're already seeing is that there's way more access to a world because of the internet, because of technology. And so, you have to work for it still, but you don't have to work as hard to be exposed to different things. Like you go home right now and look up intersectional Black feminism and come up with a whole host of things to look at and to read into, right? Kind of at the touch of your hand. And so I think that's helpful to break homogeny, right? Anti-diversity, that's helpful. I think the other thing that's gonna break this homogeny or this way of doing things, like what's happening with the Village Planning Committee, right? They're just stuck into a very old way of doing things that doesn't serve communities that are different, right? Their way of doing things is standard for Paradise Valley. That would not make sense for South Phoenix for a lot of reasons. Standard ways of building and developing don't make sense anymore. I think with climate impact and being real, and I think the older you get, the easier it is to not even have to imagine what that future would be like. I think the older you get, there's also a lot of like refusal, reluctance, certain fear to really consider and reflect what climate impact will mean. Whereas with younger generations, that I don't think that's less of a barrier. I think younger folks are starting to wrestle more and more with what that could potentially look like. And so they're asking questions. At least that's what I see. So when I see younger people show up to like a village planning committee meeting, they ask different questions anyway. More of the questions are around climate and how we're preparing for that. But no one else is asking that except for like indigenous people. And they're asking that and making practice on where their land is, but like in the urban cores of cities, those conversations aren't being had, except for by like some young folks. So I think those two things are like very real things that will spark a whole new way of thinking about a lot of stuff, but including development.
What would you say have been major influences and turning points in your life?
Major influences and turning points. So my mama, right, is a big one with organizing. Rigo Valdez was the organizer I met, I told you about. Has a special place in my heart, as like people who bring you into movement do. My brother passed away last year. That was a pretty significant event because it helped me bring together a lot more stories. So he passed away of cancer. And his relationship to his kids have really helped me understand even more the impacts of like toxic masculinity, like what that looks like internally, like in a family, and how that can be passed on generationally. So that's been a real turning point. I think with that then led to a more commitment to understanding feminism in a different way. So that's been really, really significant. Yeah. And then I would say church. It's true, it is true. So I grew up in church singing in the choir. I love to sing. It was also growing up, the thing I got made fun of the most for being gay was singing. But it's also where I find the most liberation, right? So like when it's stressful, I will go to karaoke. I will go to gay bar karaoke in particular because there's a different energy than straight bar karaoke. Try it sometime if you haven't. But that's a direct link from like things that I learned and embodied in church, of like singing, and like that was a time where I was like, oh, this is like me, unhidden, and everyone calls it gay anyway. So like, oh guys.
We talked about school and your college experience, but how about like middle school and high school and that? How that affected you?
I mean, middle school was full of a bunch of angry kids, me being one of them as well. And so, you know, you learn a lot of lessons through trauma. And so that's where I was like very quiet. High school, I was still quiet, and then I went from St. Mary's to public school to Marcos Anissa. And that was a big shift. And then doing the ACE program got me into more college classes, and I was like, oh, there's a pathway to get out, because that was still my mentality. And so high school, college then started to be where I came out of my shell, so to speak. And then college was really helpful to get out of my shell, because I was like, oh, there's a whole world out here. And it was like more carefree. It was a lot of privilege. But I had a chance to like see the world. I traveled a lot through college, which I guess was helpful. It was definitely helpful. I went to China and met my husband. So those, I guess, are the differences. But then college was also like, I hate this place for certain reasons. And it had me question, so it forced me to question a lot of things.
Okay, so is or what story is behind your tattoo?
Oh, so actually my ACE buddy, so Veronica Martinez and I were in the ACE program at South Mountain Community College, and I don't even know if they have this anymore, but they were doing this like 7 habits of highly effective teenagers, and they did this whole program, and I was part of a cohort. We were both part of this cohort called the Peer Facilitators Program, and we became best friends since then. And we came out to each other, like later on. And then she's also a person who loves to sing. And so when we came out to each other, we reconnected by going to gay bar karaoke. So that all ties together. And so we decided to get matching tattoos. And she was in a karaoke contest. And one of the people that she was in a karaoke contest that just moved here was a tattoo artist. And was like, I don't really have a clientele here, and I need to build my base. And you know a lot of people, so can I give you a tattoo? And we decided to get matching friend tattoos of queer unicorns, because that's what reminds us of each other. Yeah, so this is hers, Veronica, and she has like a version that's mine on her wrist. That's what it is.
Do you like say about like how you're very open like now or in the day you weren't like when you were younger? But like when that came to like with your family, did they like were upset or they were like accepting, or like how did that like go down with your family and like that?
So my immediate family was great. My mom and dad were great. I actually think my mom's kind of queer, to be honest with you. She's like totally a little queer. And so like she went to a gay bar before I went to a gay bar, right? She went to a lesbian bar before I went to a lesbian bar. And so she was great about it. But my extended family put parameters. So they weren't like,